Chapter 6. There was a bar high above the Las Vegas Strip with a balcony overlooking all there is to see in the city of sin. Amir had never been to Vegas, nor America. Hell, he had never been out of Istanbul. There was never any reason to leave. It was where he was born and where he always assumed he would die. He was only 22 when things flipped over, sound asleep in his home next to his pregnant wife. They always slept in a little on Sundays. In his dream, he was wandering the desert in search of water. Suddenly, he was wide awake, in the body of a young American woman in a very tight, revealing dress, and he was leaning up against the railing of a balcony high above Las Vegas overlooking the Strip. The woman whose body he had just taken over had been holding a phone and lining up a self-portrait. The first thing he saw through his new eyes was the phone falling from his new feminine hand and dropping down, down, down into the abyss below. There was loud electronic music reverberating through the vape-smoked flavored air. At the exact moment the wave of disorientation and fear washed over him, it washed over everyone else who had jumped into the body of someone partying at that bar. The balcony shook with the weight of dozens of panicked people. Unfortunately for Amir, someone who had dropped into the body of a man about 10 feet from him violently shoved the person in the body of the woman who had been dancing with him. The person in the woman's body connected with the other person in a woman's body who slammed into someone in a man's body. Essentially, a domino effect of bodies slamming into each other that culminated with the force of all of them slamming into Amir in his new, small, and thin body and sending it over the balcony. As Amir sailed through the air, his mind went blank. The situation was so overwhelming that he never even had time to wrap his head around it before it smashed into the sidewalk next to the cell phone he had previously dropped and exploded into millions of pieces. Another life full of potential that ended when things changed over. Chapter 7. She was the one who had found the latest body. Again, she had found most of them. Always the early riser, she was the first one up almost every day, and as a result, she was often the one who found the bodies. This new one had been mangled beyond recognition. By this point, she was used to seeing dead bodies and wasn't afraid to get up close and examine it, something that could not have been said about her in her old life. After about 5 minutes, she still couldn't tell who it was. That was when she went and woke everyone else up. The survivors who were holding up in a supermarket gathered near the useless registers. They weren't friends, unfortunate enough to be waiting out the winter together in what they had thought would be a safe location. Once everyone had been woken up and rounded up, they used process of elimination to figure out that this latest pile of shredded flesh had once been Jackie, the sweet 6-year-old girl who had jumped into the body of a teenage girl. Stephanie was horrified. How much longer could she stay there? When she was first welcomed into the supermarket, there had been 36 of them. One by one, their numbers had been reduced to 24. Someone was killing them, and having a good time doing it. She would have left if she could. But it was the dead of winter, and the area that was once known as England was experiencing an extremely harsh one. It was the perfect playground for a sicko. Dozens of confused, scared people trapped in bodies that didn't match their minds, and forced to live in an unfamiliar place, choosing to spend winter in the supermarket due to the food supply that was keeping them fed and the generator keeping them warm, completely boxed in and unable to escape. Snow had been consistently falling for weeks. The ground was covered with comfortably over 3 feet of dense powder outside. Temperatures were below zero. The days of snowplows coming to clear the roads were long gone. They were snowed in with a killer. If anyone were to leave the supermarket, they wouldn't get far before succumbing to the elements. If they stayed, they had no idea if they would be next, or if they would survive long enough to see the killer caught. Stay and likely die, or leave and definitely die. This was the worst choice Stephanie had ever faced. She struggled to eat and sleep. She spent most of her time crying, praying, or reading. She loved to read. It was the only thing keeping her remotely sane. For as unlucky as she was feeling, at least the new body she woke up in was an English-speaking country with plenty of books laying around. After Jackie, They agreed to sleep in shifts and stay together. No one was allowed to wander off alone, not even to use the restroom. Stephanie wondered how long it would last. There was a thick current of fear in the air. No one was comfortable. No one felt safe. Whoever was stalking them was also living among them. They were clever and patient. They would find a way. People like that always do. The group could only avoid the killer for so long. Eventually, they would have to confront them. Either that or die one by one until the killer was all who remained. What a nightmare. Everyone had shared who they were in the old world. At least who they wanted people to think they were in the old world. No one could be trusted at their word. This was one of the most dangerous aspects of the new world. Anyone could be anyone. The body of that innocent-looking little girl could be hiding the mind of a 45-year-old serial killer who had been on death row awaiting lethal injection before everything's changed. Everyone was a suspect. No one could be trusted, and no one could escape. A scenario Stephanie would rather have been watching play out on a movie from the comfort of her couch. She would have given anything to be back home on her couch with a bottle of wine and some TV, back in her old body, back in the old world. Not 6 months earlier, she was getting ready for a night out on the town. First dinner, then a party. She had graduated college in the spring near the top of her class. Earning an MBA, despite her parents' protests, she moved to Los Angeles with her two best friends. They got a crappy but cheap for L.A. 3-bedroom on Curson just south of Santa Monica Boulevard. She wasn't sure which neighborhood it was. West Hollywood adjacent was what the lady who rented it out to them said. The address simply read Los Angeles. Her goal was to become a talent agent. She wanted to represent actors, discover an unknown and build them into a star, then do it again and again and again. Become a Hollywood power player who attended events like the Academy Awards and the Met Gala. Her parents had wanted her to use her brains and education to do just about anything else, but there was no stopping her. Being a talent agent was something she had wanted since learning about it on a TV show when she was in junior high. Not long after arriving in L.A., she got a job as an assistant to a mid-level agent at one of the top agencies. She was ready to pay her dues. The job was awful. Answering phones, taking messages, running errands, scheduling appointments, rolling calls, taking notes, reading scripts, running more errands, dealing with clients, getting yelled at. You know, about exactly like it is on TV and in movies. Yet, she loved it. It was what she was there for. She knew what she was getting into and had been ready for it. There was nothing her boss could throw at her, literally or figuratively, that could deter her from the ultimate goal. And even though the jackass she was working for didn't say it, he was beginning to respect her. There was a party at a house in Silver Lake. Lots of young, hungry, new to LA types would be there. It seemed like nearly every weekend there was one of those parties. She wasn't complaining, even if she would rather been going to a bar or a club. Neither she nor her friends had the money to deal with the bar and club scene regularly. Drinks were just too damn expensive. Once a month or so. That was about it. Otherwise, it was house parties where they would go to take advantage of free or at least cheap alcohol, no lines other than for the bathroom, and no cover. The LA house parties they often found themselves at weren't nearly as wild or as big as the frat parties back at school, but she didn't mind. At least the guys hitting on her were usually only mildly buzzed and still relatively coherent versus totally smashed and completely incoherent. At least they were graduates working towards something. That was something she immediately liked about L.A., especially versus her East Coast suburban hometown. Every young transplant in L.A. was there for a reason. They were hungry, and they were ready to work for what they wanted. Those were the kinds of people she wanted to be around. One of these nights, she felt she might actually meet someone worth meeting. After all, that was the main reason she and her friends went to those parties. They said they went for the networking, and that was true to an extent. But they really went in search of some romantic company. Thus far, she'd exchanged info a few times that led to mediocre one-off dates. Twice she made out with someone. Once she even went home with a guy, but they didn't have sex. In the old world, she had been glad that they didn't have sex. Looking back on it from her new body while trapped inside the supermarket in the new world, she wished they had. After all, None of it mattered anymore. Her real body and everything she had or hadn't done with it was long gone and no longer her problem. Had she known what was coming, she wouldn't have worked or worked out so much. She would have splurged for a night at a bar or club more than once a month. She would have enjoyed the company of a few gentlemen callers. She would have eaten more cupcakes and burgers. She would have. She would have. She would have. Because who the hell cared anymore? She'd probably be dead soon anyway. She had been in the bedroom she shared with one of her roommates. They were modeling clothes for each other, making their final outfit decisions when the darkness enveloped her. When light finally returned, she found herself in a bed. Her new body was that of a teenage girl in the 14 to 15 range. The random chaos of the universe had seen fit to give her nearly 10 years back. It was a small town northeast of London. Not many people to deal with, far less chaos than in the cities. There were a handful of English speakers. They grouped up and decided to stay put at first, live off the food available in town. It wasn't until the temperature began to drop a few weeks later that they decided they should head south, but it turned out to be too late. Not long after getting on the road, the first snow began to fall. That was when they found the supermarket. Other English speakers were planning on holding up there for the winter, and there was plenty of food. Seemed like the perfect plan. The problem was that everything came together quickly. There had been no time to get to know each other or vet one another. They all simply had to hope and assume that everyone was on the level. The killer was smart and patient, made sure to wait out the first 2 weeks until the point of no return had passed, until everyone was stuck there for the duration of the winter. Then the fun began. Another morning, another dead body. This time it was Jay, the Canadian middle school teacher who had jumped into the body of a woman in her 20s. He had been part of Stephanie's original group from the small town. He was a good guy, desperately wanted to get home to what used to be Canada someday. He had been married with 2 small children whom he was constantly worried about, even though he knew he would never see them again, and that there was a strong chance that they were dead. The killer had carved out his eyeballs and removed half of his teeth. Every other tooth, to be exact. The removals were alternated between the top and the bottom, so that his closed mouth looked like a twisted checkerboard. Stephanie could not help but wonder if the mutilations had been done before or after the sexual abuse, but it was sickening. Despite the group's plan to sleep in shifts and never wander off alone, the killer had still managed to get their hands on Jay, and do it without anyone seeing or hearing a peep. It should not have been possible, but it happened. No one was safe. Stephanie began weighing her options. She had lost faith in the supermarket as a place where she could survive the winter. In any other situation, she would have already been long gone. But the blizzard, the damn blizzard, it was not letting up, and no cavalry was coming to save her. By all estimations, it was sometime in February. Winter wasn't going away anytime soon. At least not soon enough. Stephanie worried that she and everyone else would be dead by the time the snow melted, if the killer had their way. Add on top of that she was on the other side of the world in unfamiliar territory. Her odds of survival out in the cold were non-existent. What direction would she go? How far would she have to go before she could get out of the blizzard? What or who would she find? Maybe if I just stay careful and don't take any chances and always stay in groups, I'll be fine, she thought. She didn't really believe that. How could she? After what had just happened to Jay. There didn't seem to be much of a pattern to the killings either. Usually people in women's bodies, but the occasional man's body was thrown in too. The people in women's bodies were all sexually abused either before or after they were killed. This fact theoretically narrowed down the suspects to people in men's bodies. At the same time, a man in a woman's body could have been using those methods as cover. All victims' bodies had been mutilated in some manner, never in the same way. But there were some patterns. The eyes, always the eyes, carved out and placed somewhere else on or in the body, sometimes simply in the hands, other times in the mouth. One body had been sliced open and the eyes were left in the stomach. It made Stephanie want to cry every time she thought about it. The thought of her new body ending up like that was unbearable. Aside from the eyes, the killer's other signature move was skinning the faces of their victims. Unlike with the eyes, the skin was always nowhere to be found. This added to the difficulty in identifying remains. Piles of discarded facial skin would eventually turn up in various parts of the store a day or two after its matching body had been found. Some sort of sick reminder left behind by the killer for the rest of the group to find. Before all the madness tore her life from her hands, flipped it over, turned it inside, and shredded it into pieces, Stephanie had been the pride and joy of her family. Neither of her parents were particularly intelligent or successful, at least not in any traditional, glamorous, or corporate America sense. Her father managed a local hardware store, something that had happened to him completely by accident. It was a local spot in their quiet New Hampshire town that locals loved enough to support despite the chains. He had started working in the back during junior high. Then he moved to the floor in high school. He had no college prospects nor the means to pay tuition, so he simply kept on working at the store. Eventually, he was promoted to manager, and had been there ever since. He had become the owner's right-hand man. They were like family. The hardware store was where Stephanie's father met her mother. She was 8 years younger and began working as a cashier while in high school. One thing led to another, and along came Stephanie. Her mother was only 19 when she gave birth. They got married, and in a complete surprise to everyone, they stayed together. Even had 2 more kids, but not until Stephanie was 10. As a result, Stephanie didn't have too close a relationship with her 2 younger siblings. Stephanie's mother worked when she could, mostly cashier work at the store. That was what made Stephanie so special. The intelligent, hard-working, and driven child who was set to do great things. Stephanie even earned a partial academic scholarship to a great college. The only true rift between her and her parents was her desire to be a talent agent in Hollywood. They wanted her to play it safe. The idea of taking a risk was a foreign concept. Why can't you just be like a lawyer or do something in business or finance? Maybe become CEO at a big company. You don't just walk in and become CEO, Mom. What if you started your own company? No matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't get them to understand. You would think, she thought, 2 people who never even went to college would be cool with anything. But they just didn't get it. Luckily, they had her 2 younger siblings. Once she was settled in Los Angeles with her job at the talent agency, all attention shifted toward the little Sibs. It wasn't like they disowned Stephanie or anything. They remained in touch, but they treated her like something of an afterthought. Her smart but weird daughter who was throwing it all away on a Hollywood pipe dream. Stephanie wanted so badly to prove them wrong. Sadly, she never would get the chance. After things changed over, all she wanted was to see them again and tell them she loved them, if they were even still alive, if she even managed to survive the supermarket. With the group's numbers dwindling down to only 14, the supermarket began to feel even larger and more cavernous than it already was. Of the 14 who remained, it was an even 7-7 split between people in men's bodies and people in women's bodies. The killer was sure to keep the ratio close. There was not a single corner where Stephanie felt safe. She never walked even 10 feet from another person. She was okay with being around only one person if that person was in a woman's body. She refused to be alone with someone in a man's body. Even though it was possible that the killer was wearing a woman's body, she felt in her bones that it was someone in a man's body. She also always carried a hammer. It likely wouldn't save her if push came to shove, but it was better than just giving up. The bastard continued to remain patient. There was no pattern, no schedule, no timetable. Sometimes 2 or 3 people would die within the span of 1 week. Sometimes no one would die for 2 weeks. With so few people left, it made sense to space them out, to savor every last one. It was during those lulls between kills when people would start to let their guard down. Then they'd wake up and find another mangled corpse, a reminder that there was still a predator among them, and they were the prey. Some members of the group wanted to segregate everyone by outward gender, keep the men's bodies away from the women's. But the people in men's bodies argued that it wouldn't stop the killer. He would find a way. Despite being convinced that the killer was in a man's body, Stephanie was against the segregation. She still believed in safety in numbers. One person, who had the body of a young boy, approximately 14 years old, but claimed to have the mind of an adult who had been a police officer, wanted to interrogate everyone, but no one could take him at his word. No one knew if this person had actually been a cop. For all they knew, he was the killer using the body of a young boy as cover. Who would expect a boy that young? Only he wasn't a boy that young. It was a problem that no one knew how to solve, and every second that ticked by meant that they were 1 second closer to the next eventual murder. Stephanie had to get out of there. She needed the weather to break. She spent far too much time cursing fate for putting her in that situation. To survive the initial chaos of everything changing over, only to find herself there, was like some sort of cruel joke. Only the killer was laughing. She began spending her days near the large window at the front of the store facing the parking lot. She had given up trying to read since she could no longer concentrate. Now she just stared out the window. There wasn't anything to see through the glass other than snow, but there was something about watching the powder blow in waves one direction, then the other, over and over, that relaxed her. Growing up in New Hampshire, she had experienced more than her fair share of snow, and she wasn't a fan. Even though it was beautiful when stared at through a window while inside, she hated dealing with it. It gets stuck in your shoes. It covers your windshield and needs to be scraped off. It blankets the roads and needs to be plowed. It can cause deadly car wrecks. Plain and simple, it's an inconvenience. It had never been more inconvenient than now, although she would have moved to Los Angeles regardless of the weather. One of the aspects of the urban sprawl next to the Pacific she had been most excited about was the lack of snow. She thought about this while staring at the England powder through the window. Of course I'm going to die because of snow. Since it had been early in the morning for England when everything changed over, the store had not been open, and the parking lot was empty save for a handful of cars that likely belonged to the employees who were prepping the store for its eventual open. All long gone by that point. No bodies had been found when the group first took over the store, so Stephanie liked to think that everyone who jumped into the body of a store employee was somewhere safe. Their cars remained vacant in the lot, buried beneath the mountains of snow. Stephanie stared at the snow mountains, wishing she could get in one and drive away. But there were no keys. She and the others had looked. Their best guess was that they were in the pockets of the people in the store and carried off when their new inhabitants fled the area. It was likely in the 70s back in L.A. And there she was, snowed in during the apocalypse while a killer patiently awaited their opportunity to carve her up. Her mind once again drifted off, and she imagined herself back in L.A., working for that jackass agent. Oh, how trivial his requests now seemed. It may have even been a weekend. She had lost track of what day it was weeks ago. All she had was her estimation that it was late February, maybe even early March. Either way, it could have been a weekend. If that were the case, since it was evening in England, it would be afternoon in Los Angeles. She'd likely be out running errands, since Saturday during the day was when she normally got things done. Maybe she'd be at a pool party somewhere. She did sometimes blow off her errands for pool parties, but she would likely be doing errands. Then she would go home and get ready to go out, all dolled up for a night on the town. First dinner with her friends, then off to their destination. Maybe West Hollywood, maybe downtown, maybe even among the chaos of Sunset. Probably at another one of those house parties she had once found so underwhelming but would now give anything to be at. If only. She must have dozed off, because when the scream woke her, it was pitch black both inside and outside. Maybe the scream had been part of her dream. Then she heard it again, coming from the back of the store. Next, she heard the commotion of others racing back there. Even though she knew what it was, she had to see for herself. It was Mary this time. According to the person inside the body, Mary had been a woman from Texas. The new body she was living in was that of a large, round man. She hadn't been happy about her new reality. The killer had carved open her large belly, then sliced off her right hand and placed it in the gaping hole, mixed in with whatever intestines that hadn't drooled out. They also hadn't finished the job. Mary still had her eyes and her facial skin. She had managed to let out 2 loud screams, so the killer sliced her throat before disappearing into the darkness of the store and re-emerging with the rest of the group, blending in with the crowd and pretending to be shocked. Stephanie scanned the faces of everyone in the crowd, but they were weakly illuminated by flashlight, and it wasn't enough to get a good read. Everyone had the same expression, a combination of shock, confusion, anger, fear, easy emotions to express. Stephanie couldn't discern a tell. That was it for her. She couldn't stay much longer, even with the snow. She had to find a way. It was night, and she still needed a plan. So she gave herself 48 hours to make this plan and hopefully make her escape. She would rather freeze to death out there than get sliced up in here. Back during her Los Angeles life, there was something else Stephanie had been looking forward to. Her first trip to Las Vegas. It was only 3 weeks away when things changed over. One of her roommates was turning 26 and they had decided to make the drive. Stephanie had wanted to go for years, basically since turning 21. Her friends mainly wanted to go for the clubs and bars. Everyone knows that Vegas clubs are something else. And sure, Stephanie was excited about that too. Especially Marble Rooftop Bar, since they had made reservations for Saturday night. The hottest rooftop bar in town. High above the strip with a massive balcony, complete with social media-friendly views. That was something to look forward to. What she was most excited for, however, was to play blackjack in Vegas. Stephanie loved blackjack. She had played periodically throughout college at a casino not too far from campus after turning 21. Working as a server in college, she always had a little tip money to spare. She had studied blackjack techniques. She wasn't a math genius, so her counting skills were rudimentary at best, but she knew all the plays backward and forward. Never did she find herself in a situation where she didn't know what the mathematically best move was. Even if she didn't have a perfect beat on the count, she could at least give her odds a boost by always knowing the best play. She was logical like that. She was also organized and focused. She had been an incredible student, always able to study the required materials, retain the knowledge, and apply it as necessary. Sometimes when alone in the new world and not thinking about her escape plan, she liked to imagine how the Vegas trip would have turned out. It would have been over by now, come and gone, a memory to reflect on instead of plans she never got to live out. She always imagined it turning out well. Why bother to imagine it turning out anything less than amazing when it was never going to happen, and she might wake up dead tomorrow? She imagined herself getting hot on the Friday night after arriving, making enough to pay for her drinks with plenty left over to build upon the next day. Saturday, she would murder the tables all day long and use her winnings to buy the most expensive thing on the menu at her roommate's fancy birthday dinner. Then she'd buy drinks for everyone when they went to Marble. She would still have winnings left over to buy in on Sunday morning before they left. That final session would add some nice going-away money to set her up for the next month or 3. It was a nice fantasy. A great distraction from her depressing reality. The last thing she dreamt about while at the supermarket was splitting aces against a 5. Her eyes opened to darkness and a strange feeling. It was unusual. Even under the circumstances, she usually slept through the night. The hard part was falling asleep with everything on her mind. But once asleep, she usually stayed asleep. No difference than how it had been in the old world. She had always been a good sleeper. During her 2nd or 3rd week in Los Angeles, she slept through an earthquake. The next day, when her roommates and everyone at work asked her about it, she had no idea what they were talking about. The makeshift bed she slept on at the supermarket was nothing more than a sleeping bag and a pillow she had originally found at the house she woke up in. She had lugged them with on the journey south. Beneath the sleeping bag were a few jackets that had been harvested from dead bodies for extra padding. At first, the thought of taking and using clothes from corpses made her skin crawl. That was then. Now she didn't think much of it at all. After all, as far as she knew, they weren't making any new clothes. A part of the escape plan she had been working on involved bundling up with multiple layers of those same clothes. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. She decided she needed to get up and take a walk. After quietly unzipping the sleeping bag, she crawled out and started putting on her boots. She was already fully dressed otherwise, since the supermarket got a little chilly at night. Paul, a man now living in the woman's body, was on watch duty. People in men's bodies were not allowed to keep watch. Paul asked what she was doing. "Bad dreams. Need to move around." "Don't go too far." "I won't." "Take these." He held out a hammer and a flashlight. She had forgotten her hammer under her pillow. What an absent-minded mistake. She took Paul's offering. "Just in case," he said as she accepted them before nodding and heading her way. Her mind was still stuck on an escape plan. It was a suicide plan. She knew that, but so was staying. At least by leaving, she was putting her fate in her own hands, right? The thoughts were interrupted by a sound. It was familiar, but too distant to place. A combination of grinding and biting, perhaps. She searched the sound library of her mind to find a match, but came up empty. Her stomach sank at the feeling that it was something bad, almost as if it was a natural instinct. She knew that this was more than just a feeling. The sound she was hearing was bad, very bad, but she couldn't resist. She had to see. It was pitch black in the store. Had she not been there so long and committed every aisle, nook, and cranny to memory, she would have been crashing into things every 5 seconds. Instead, she was silent. There was technically no need for the flashlight Paul gave her, since she knew her way around even in the dark. Hopefully no need for the hammer either. Both were for just in case. In one of many moves she would soon regret, she removed her boots to silence her steps. With nothing more than 2 layers of socks on, she was basically a ninja. Her quiet steps continued heading toward the direction of the sound that was getting slightly louder with each step. It was like a grinding, and it was constant, back and forth, back and forth. Then it hit her. It was sawing. Someone was quietly sawing. Her breath caught in her throat and her heart began to pound like a jackhammer against her chest. She knew what was happening. She knew she should turn back and get the others, but was too close. It was impossible to stop herself, no matter how much she knew she should. She had to see. She reached the end of an aisle to a corner of the store that was commonly used for food prep. The sawing was unmistakable, quiet enough that it would never reach the sleeping area, and this corner was outside of the watch perimeter. Since the store was so big and their group so small, they had decided to all sleep in one corner and keep a tight perimeter. Stephanie had to see who was being sawed, and who was doing the sawing. She had to know. So she aimed the flashlight in the direction of the sound and flicked it on. The saw was grinding back and forth on the back of a neck. She couldn't tell for certain whose it was. The hand guiding it was big and strong. Even with sleeves covering the arms, she knew who they belonged to. They had picked him up somewhere along the way. He was traveling with someone in a child's body whom he claimed to be protecting. That was enough for them to deem him safe, especially since the person wearing the child's body vouched for the very large and imposing person in a man's body. Plus, people in the bodies of strong men were going to be in high demand in the new world. He kept quiet the entire ride, mostly watching over the child, who was a child in body only. The body was of a girl roughly 5 years old, but the mind was apparently of a woman named Grace from Connecticut who claimed to have been 86 before everything changed over. They did not seem interested in being friendly. They only wanted to group up for safety in numbers. The person in the strong male body claimed to be a teenage boy named Taylor from Florida who had just been at home playing video games when it happened. His real use would reveal itself once they arrived at the supermarket and began to settle in. Manual labor was necessary in their new reality. Something large and heavy always needed to be moved. Taylor was happy to help. He seemed to really enjoy his newfound size and strength. He always wore a black hooded sweatshirt with the sleeves down. never rolled up no matter how hot and sweaty he looked. Even so, it was hard not to notice those big muscular arms and the tattoos peeking out from the sleeves. Stephanie couldn't help finding the body Taylor was wearing to be physically attractive. Unfortunately, she couldn't say the same for the mind living inside it. She didn't like his personality. There was something about him that seemed off, socially awkward. He didn't know how to hold a conversation. Any time she did find herself chatting with him, she counted the seconds until she could escape. Once winter truly set in, Taylor and Grace stuck together while befriending some others. They rarely spoke with Stephanie, and she was glad of that. Grace was the first victim. In hindsight, it struck Stephanie that this had probably been done intentionally to throw everyone off Taylor's scent. After all, the two had been inseparable since the beginning. He mourned alone in the corner for days. Any time someone tried to comfort him, he shrugged them off. Then more bodies started showing up and everyone became focused on survival. They forgot about sad, quiet Taylor. This freed him up to stalk them one by one in the night and tear them to shreds. Before she knew it, Stephanie was out in the darkness, surrounded by the snow and the bitter cold. The last few moments were a haze. After locking eyes with Taylor, she dropped the flashlight, then threw the hammer at him before bolting through the supermarket, past Paul, who was still keeping watch. He shouted something unintelligible at her as she burst through the doors, across the snow-filled parking lot, and into the night. By the time she ran out of gas and looked back, the store was gone. How far had she run? She hadn't had time to think, no time to prepare. Once her heart rate slowed and her breathing normalized, she realized just how cold she was. She remembered that she didn't have shoes on, only 2 layers of socks, and wasn't wearing a jacket. That was when she knew she was going to die out there, alone and soon. Better than being gutted by that freak. Perhaps she should have run into Paul and alerted him instead of blasting right past him, or started yelling and waking everyone up. Maybe she had. She didn't remember. It was all a haze. She had blacked out from the shock and fear. It struck her that she knew the identity of the killer, and if she knew his identity, then she could help stop him. She could tell the others, and they could put an end to his terror. She hadn't needed to run at all. It had been an impulsive action, and a foolish one. She should go back. Why should she freeze to death out in this mess? Taylor was the one who should die. There was only one problem. She didn't know which way was back. The wind had brushed over all the powder, reforming it and making her tracks disappear. Her blacked-out, chaotic escape had caused her to completely lose track of where she was. Was she really going to die like this? Impulsively running away? It was so cold, the coldest she'd ever been. And she was from New Hampshire. Maybe they'll send someone after me. She chose the direction that felt right and started walking. The supermarket had to be close. She couldn't have gotten that far. It didn't matter. It was too cold. She had already lost feeling in her feet. Wherever the store was, she couldn't make it. That was when she heard it. Quiet, distant at first, but louder and closer by the second, and unmistakable. Cars, trucks, lots of them. She looked around and spotted the lights in the distance. It was tough to see clearly with the wind blowing snow all around her, but somehow, some way, there was a caravan of cars out on the road, and she could see their lights. Whatever energy she had left in her exhausted, freezing body pushed her toward the caravan. She had to get in their path. It was her only chance. The lethal combination of pain and numbness got worse with each labored step. But it was life or death, and she wanted to live. Thanks to the snow and the howling wind, the caravan was moving slow enough for her to gauge their path and get in front of it. Once they were approaching her dead on, she started frantically waving her arms and yelling, "Stop! Help!" They stopped. She looked up at the sky and thanked whoever was up there, something she never thought she'd do again. She couldn't tell how many vehicles were in the caravan since the headlights were shining in her face, but she estimated at least 5, likely more. Doors began opening. People stepped out and guns were drawn. Then a voice of someone in a man's body pierced through it all. "What the hell are you doing out here?" She rode in a cargo van. The 3 lead vehicles were all snowplows, and the rest followed. When she told them why she was out there, they offered to take her back. But she was exhausted, on the verge of hypothermia, and barely conscious. All she could muster was, "Take me with you," before passing out. Upon returning to consciousness the next morning, she was glad to be with them, glad to be on the move. These people weren't waiting for spring. They were heading south to get warmer and safer. That sounded good to her. "Another 10 minutes or so, and you wouldn't have made it," said the woman in a man's body who was tending to her. She claimed to have been a doctor before everything changed over. Even though Stephanie would survive, her right foot had succumbed to frostbite and had to be amputated right there in the moving van. The doctor had brought all the medical supplies she could fit and had what she needed to remove the foot and close off the wound with minimal pain and blood loss. Luckily for Stephanie, somehow her left foot had been salvaged. The doctor kept Stephanie on a steady diet of painkillers throughout the rest of the journey. When she wasn't drifting in and out of consciousness, she mostly sat quiet, alone with her thoughts on the people at the supermarket. Perhaps in her escape she had alerted them to Taylor, and he had been stopped. If not, he would be done with all of them by the time the snow thawed. Then he'd be off someplace else to take more lives. She hoped to God she'd never cross paths with him again. The guilt that she could have stopped him and saved countless lives would come later. For now, she was relieved to still be alive. The strangest sight on the ride was one of the people she shared the van with, a person in a young woman's body with the mind of a man. He was very pregnant and getting the doctor's attention when she wasn't focused on Stephanie. A pregnant person in all this? How is that possible? Afraid to ask the doctor or anyone else what the story was, Stephanie made the logical assumption that she was looking at a future pureborn, that the unborn child had been conceived and would be born after everything had changed over, meaning its mind and body would theoretically be aligned. Imagine being born into this shit show. The man in the pregnant woman's body didn't say much, just looked worn down and sad all the time. No, not worn down, beaten down, battered. He was sadder than anyone Stephanie had ever seen, both in the old world and the new. Once he opened his mouth wide enough for Stephanie to get a glimpse, multiple teeth were missing. It would be years before Stephanie found out what had happened to the pureborn's parent in the early days, how the pureborn came to be. But she didn't need to know the full story to understand that something very bad had happened. Still, the sight of someone carrying a child in this world put Stephanie at ease. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since waking up in her new body, she felt a sense of optimism. There would be some tough years ahead as she learned to cope with the loss of her old life and living in this new world without a foot. But she would find sanctuary in her new home, solace in reading, and purpose in becoming an educator. She would never see the man who called himself Taylor again, but she would hear about him, and she would never forget a single detail about him.